In the sprawling mansions of New York's Fifth Avenue during the Gilded Age of 1895, where fortunes were built on steel and ambition, the most dangerous secrets were often hidden behind the most beautiful facades. When railroad magnate Harrison Blackwood found himself cornered by scandal and desperate for respectability, he made a calculated decision that would change everything. He chose the one woman in his household who could never betray his secrets, or so he thought. But sometimes the quietest voices carry the most devastating truths, and when they finally speak, empires crumble. What Harrison didn't know was that his silent servant had been listening all along. The crystal chandeliers of the Blackwood mansion cast dancing shadows across the marble floors as 23-year-old Evangeline Rose moved silently through the opulent corridors, her worn leather shoes making no sound against the polished stone. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her plain grey dress marked her as what the household staff whispered she was, the mute servant girl who had appeared at their door 3 years ago, seeking work and speaking not a word. Harrison Blackwood, heir to the vast Blackwood Railroad empire, stood in his father's mahogany-panelled study, his jaw clenched as he faced the family patriarch. At 31, Harrison possessed the sharp features and commanding presence that had made him New York society's most eligible bachelor, but today his usual confidence was nowhere to be found. "The Pemberton scandal has reached the newspapers," his father, Cornelius Blackwood, declared, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Your association with that married woman has made you a liability to this family's reputation. The board is questioning your judgment, and our investors are growing nervous." Harrison's hands tightened into fists at his sides. It was a momentary indiscretion, nothing more. "Nothing more?" Cornelius slammed his palm against the desk. "You were photographed leaving her hotel at dawn, Harrison. The headlines are calling you a home wrecker. We've built this empire on respectability, and you've jeopardized everything for a fleeting romance." Through the partially open door, Evangeline paused in her dusting, her green eyes fixed on the conversation unfolding within. She had learned to read lips years ago, a skill that had proven invaluable in a world where people assumed her deafness accompanied her silence. "What do you propose I do?" Harrison asked, his voice heavy with resignation. Cornelius moved to the window, gazing out at the bustling streets below. "Marriage. Immediate marriage to a woman of impeccable reputation. Someone who can restore the family name and convince our associates that you've settled into respectability." "And who exactly would agree to such an arrangement? Every suitable woman in New York has heard the gossip." A cruel smile played at Cornelius's lips. "Someone who has no choice in the matter, someone who cannot refuse or betray our family secrets." His gaze fell upon Evangeline's figure in the hallway. "Someone who cannot speak." Harrison followed his father's gaze, his eyes landing on the young woman who had served their household with quiet efficiency for 3 years. Evangeline was beautiful in an understated way, with delicate features and a grace that spoke of better breeding than her current circumstances suggested. More importantly, she was utterly dependent on their charity and completely unable to expose any family secrets. "You cannot be serious," Harrison said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's young, presentable, and most crucially silent. A marriage of convenience that serves our purposes perfectly. She'll be grateful for the elevation in status, and society will see it as an act of noble charity. A wealthy man rescuing a disadvantaged woman." Evangeline's heart raced as she processed their words. She had always known that her position in the household was precarious, but she had never imagined becoming a pawn in their schemes. Her fingers trembled as she continued her work, careful not to reveal that she understood every word. "The girl has no family, no connections," Cornelius continued. "She appeared here seeking work with nothing but the clothes on her back. She's perfect for our needs." Harrison studied Evangeline's profile, noting the way the afternoon light caught the copper highlights in her hair. "What if she refuses? Where would she go? What options does a mute servant have in this world? We'll present it as an opportunity, not a demand. She'll accept because she has no alternative. That evening, as Evangeline prepared the dining room for the family's dinner, Harrison approached her with measured steps. She looked up from arranging the silver, her green eyes meeting his with a mixture of wariness and curiosity. "Evangeline," he began, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it, "I have a proposition that could change your circumstances considerably." She tilted her head, encouraging him to continue while her heart hammered against her ribs. "My family requires that I marry quickly to restore our reputation after some unfortunate publicity. I'm prepared to offer you a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement that would provide you with security and status in exchange for your discretion and cooperation." Evangeline's eyes widened, but she remained silent, her hands stilling on the silverware. "You would want for nothing," Harrison continued. "Fine clothes, your own quarters, respect from society. All I ask is that you play the role of a devoted wife in public. In private, we would maintain separate lives." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy cloak. She understood that this was not truly a choice, but a beautifully wrapped command. Her survival depended on the Blackwood family's goodwill, and refusing would mean destitution. Slowly, she nodded her acceptance, sealing a bargain that would change both their lives forever. But as Harrison smiled with satisfaction and walked away, Evangeline's reflection in the polished silver revealed something he had failed to notice. The sharp intelligence in her eyes and the slight curve of her lips that suggested she knew far more about the Blackwood family's secrets than anyone suspected. What would happen when the wedding bells rang and New York society gathered to witness this unusual union? The grand ballroom of the Blackwood mansion had been transformed into a vision of Gilded Age splendor for what New York society was calling the wedding of the season. Crystal chandeliers cast warm light over arrangements of white roses and gold ribbon, while the city's most influential families gathered in their finest attire. The December air outside was crisp with winter's bite, but inside, the atmosphere buzzed with curiosity and barely concealed gossip. Evangeline stood before the ornate mirror in what had once been a servant's quarters, now hastily converted into a bridal suite. The ivory silk gown that had been commissioned for her fit perfectly, its high neckline and long sleeves modest yet elegant. Pearl buttons ran down the back, and delicate lace adorned the cuffs and hem. Her auburn hair had been styled into an elaborate updo, with small white flowers woven throughout. Mrs. Whitmore, the head housekeeper, fussed around her with pins and powder. "You look like a proper lady, dear," she whispered, though her eyes held a mixture of sympathy and concern. "Just remember to keep your head high and smile when they look at you." Through the window, Evangeline could see the carriages arriving, the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Whitneys, all of New York's elite coming to witness Harrison Blackwood's redemption through marriage. She had spent the past 2 weeks learning to navigate in fine clothing, practicing her posture and the subtle gestures expected of a society wife. But beneath her composed exterior, her mind raced with the conversations she had overheard, the secrets she had gathered during her 3 years of invisible service. Downstairs, Harrison adjusted his white tie for the 3rd time, his reflection in the hallway mirror showing a man who appeared confident but whose eyes betrayed his unease. His best man, Theodore Ashford, clapped him on the shoulder. "Nervous about marrying a servant girl?" Theodore asked with a smirk. "The whole city's talking about your charitable gesture, though some are calling it desperation." "It's a practical arrangement," Harrison replied curtly. "She's grateful for the opportunity, and I need a wife who won't interfere with my affairs." What Harrison didn't notice was the figure of Charlotte Pemberton, his former lover's younger sister, standing near the staircase, her blue eyes glittering with malice. Charlotte had been devastated when Harrison's scandal with her married sister had ended their own secret courtship. Now, dressed in a stunning emerald gown that complemented her blonde hair, She watched the proceedings with the calculating gaze of someone planning revenge. The ceremony began promptly at 4 o'clock. Reverend Matthews, a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, stood before the assembled guests as Harrison took his place at the altar. The string quartet played Mendelssohn's Wedding March as all eyes turned toward the grand staircase. Evangeline descended slowly, her hand resting lightly on the banister. The gasps and murmurs from the crowd were audible. She was far more beautiful than anyone had expected. Her transformation from servant to bride was so complete that several guests questioned whether this was truly the same woman who had served them tea just weeks before. Harrison watched her approach with genuine surprise. In the elegant gown, with her hair styled and her posture refined, Evangeline looked every inch the society bride. For a moment he almost forgot this was merely a business transaction. As she reached the altar, Evangeline's eyes met his briefly before focusing on Reverend Matthews. The ceremony proceeded with traditional vows, Harrison's voice strong and clear, while Evangeline nodded her responses. Her silence explained to the guests as a result of her condition. "Do you, Harrison Cornelius Blackwood, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" "I do," Harrison replied, slipping a diamond ring onto Evangeline's finger. "And do you, Evangeline Rose, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, till death do you part?" Evangeline nodded solemnly, her green eyes never leaving the Reverend's face. "By the power vested in me by the state of New York, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Harrison leaned forward and placed a chaste kiss on Evangeline's lips, the contact brief but witnessed by all. The crowd erupted in polite applause as the newlyweds turned to face their guests. The reception that followed was a lavish affair. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies: oysters from Long Island, roasted duck with cherry sauce, champagne that sparkled like liquid gold. The Blackwood family spared no expense in demonstrating their continued prosperity and social standing. Evangeline moved through the crowd on Harrison's arm, nodding graciously as guests offered their congratulations. She had studied the guest list carefully, memorizing names and faces, understanding the complex web of relationships that governed New York society. "Such a romantic story," gushed Mrs. Astor, the undisputed queen of New York society. "A wealthy gentleman rescuing a disadvantaged young woman. It's quite like something from a novel." Harrison smiled charmingly. "Evangeline has brought such peace to my life. Sometimes the heart chooses in the most unexpected ways." But as the evening progressed, Charlotte Pemberton began to execute her plan. She moved through the crowd like a serpent, whispering carefully chosen words to influential guests. "Of course it's admirable that Harrison married her," she said to Mrs. Whitney, her voice carrying just far enough, "though one does wonder about the timing. So soon after his scandal with my poor sister." To another group she added, "I heard she was found wandering the streets with no memory of her past. Who knows what sort of background she really comes from?" The whispers began to spread like wildfire through the ballroom. Guests who had been charmed by the romantic narrative began to question the true motives behind the marriage. Was this really love, or was Harrison Blackwood so desperate to restore his reputation that he would marry anyone? The moment of truth came during the traditional wedding toast. Cornelius Blackwood stood, raising his crystal champagne flute, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we gather tonight to celebrate not just a marriage, but a testament to the power of love to overcome all obstacles. My son Harrison has chosen a bride who may not speak with words, but whose character speaks volumes." The crowd murmured approval, but Charlotte seized her moment. Rising from her table, her voice clear and carrying, she called out, "How fortunate that she cannot speak to contradict the stories told about her past." A hush fell over the ballroom. All eyes turned to Charlotte, then to Harrison and Evangeline. The tension was palpable as Charlotte continued, her words dripping with false sweetness. "I mean no offense, of course. It's just that in my experience, the most interesting people always have the most fascinating secrets. Don't you agree, Mrs. Blackwood?" All eyes turned to Evangeline, who stood perfectly still beside her new husband. The silence stretched uncomfortably as the guests waited for some response, some acknowledgement of Charlotte's veiled challenge. Harrison's jaw tightened as he realized Charlotte's game. "My wife's past is her own business," he said firmly. "What matters is our future together." But Charlotte wasn't finished. "Oh, but surely she can at least nod to acknowledge such a lovely sentiment, or perhaps she's overwhelmed by all the attention." The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Some guests exchanged glances, sensing the undercurrent of malice in Charlotte's words. Others leaned forward, curious to see how this drama would unfold. Evangeline felt the weight of every gaze in the room. She understood that this moment would define not just her marriage, but her entire future in New York society. Charlotte's challenge was clear: respond and risk exposure, or remain silent and appear weak. For 3 years, she had perfected the art of invisibility, of being present but unnoticed. Now standing in the center of the most important ballroom in New York, wearing a wedding dress that cost more than most people earned in a year, she realized that her days of hiding were over. Slowly, deliberately, Evangeline turned to face Charlotte Pemberton. Her green eyes met the blonde woman's blue ones with a steady gaze that held no fear, no submission. Instead, there was something else, a quiet confidence that made several guests lean forward with interest. Then, to the shock of everyone present, Evangeline smiled. Not the demure, grateful smile of a rescued servant, but the knowing smile of a woman who held cards no one suspected she possessed. The silence in the ballroom became deafening as guests realized they were witnessing something unprecedented. Harrison stared at his new wife with growing unease, suddenly aware that he might have underestimated the woman he had just married. What secret lay behind Evangeline's enigmatic smile, and how would it change everything the Blackwood family thought they knew about their carefully orchestrated plan? The morning after the wedding dawned grey and cold, with frost coating the windows of the Blackwood mansion like delicate lace. Evangeline sat in what was now her private sitting room, a space that had been hastily redecorated to befit her new status as Mrs. Harrison Blackwood. The room was elegant but impersonal, cream silk wallpaper, mahogany furniture, and oil paintings of pastoral scenes that meant nothing to her. She wore a morning dress of deep blue wool, her hair arranged in a simple chignon that emphasized the graceful line of her neck. In her hands, she held a leather-bound journal, its pages filled with careful observations written in a precise, educated script, observations that would have shocked anyone who believed her to be an illiterate servant girl. The events of the previous evening replayed in her mind. Charlotte Pemberton's challenge had been met with silence, but Evangeline knew it was only the beginning. The blonde socialite had tasted blood in the water and would not rest until she had exposed what she believed to be a fraud. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Harrison entered without waiting for permission, his face bearing the strain of a sleepless night. He had changed from his wedding attire into a charcoal grey suit, but his usually immaculate appearance showed signs of distress, his tie slightly askew, his hair bearing the marks of anxious fingers. "We need to discuss last night," he said without preamble, closing the door behind him. Charlotte Pemberton's behavior was inappropriate, but her questions raised concerns among our guests. Evangeline looked up from her journal, her green eyes meeting his with that same unsettling calm she had displayed at the reception. She closed the book carefully and placed it on the side table, her movements deliberate and graceful. "The marriage contract we agreed upon was based on your silence," Harrison continued, beginning to pace the length of the room. "But silence in the face of direct challenge appears weak. Society expects a certain presence from a Blackwood wife. He paused near the window, his reflection ghost-like in the frost-covered glass. My father suggests we remove ourselves from the city for a time, allow the gossip to die down while you adjust to your new circumstances. Evangeline tilted her head slightly, a gesture that had become familiar to the household staff. It was her way of indicating attention without commitment, understanding without agreement. There's a property upstate, Harrison explained. Thornfield Manor near the Hudson River. It's been in my mother's family for generations. We could spend the winter there, away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. The mention of his mother brought a flicker of something, pain, perhaps, across Harrison's features. Margaret Blackwood had died when he was 15, leaving behind a son who had never quite learned to navigate the emotional complexities of human relationships. You would have freedom there, he added, his voice softening slightly. Space to be yourself, whatever that means. Evangeline rose from her chair with fluid grace, moving to a small writing desk near the window. She withdrew a piece of cream-colored stationery and a fountain pen, writing a few lines in her careful script before handing the paper to Harrison. I understand your concerns about last evening. A change of scenery would be welcome. When do we depart? Harrison stared at the note, his eyebrows rising slightly. The handwriting was educated, refined, not what one would expect from a woman who had appeared at their door seeking work as a servant. The vocabulary, the sentence structure, even the quality of the penmanship spoke of breeding and education. Your writing is quite accomplished, he said carefully. Evangeline returned to her chair and picked up her journal again, effectively ending the conversation. But Harrison had seen enough to plant seeds of doubt about everything he thought he knew about his new wife. 3 days later, their carriage wound through the snow-covered landscape of the Hudson Valley, the horse's breath creating clouds of vapor in the crisp winter air. Evangeline sat across from Harrison, wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, watching the scenery pass with genuine interest. She had not been outside New York City in 3 years, and the sight of snow-laden pine trees and frozen streams stirred something deep within her. Thornfield Manor emerged from the winter landscape like something from a Gothic novel. Built of grey stone with tall windows and ivy-covered walls, it possessed a romantic melancholy that spoke of generations of family history. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating that the small staff had prepared for their arrival. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, the manor's housekeeper, greeted them at the entrance. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent brown eyes that missed nothing. Unlike the servants in the city mansion, she showed no deference to Harrison's authority, treating him instead with the familiarity of someone who had known him since childhood. Master Harrison, she said warmly, embracing him despite his formal demeanor, and this must be your bride. Welcome to Thornfield, my dear. Evangeline found herself enveloped in a genuine embrace, the first she had received in years. Mrs. Hartwell's kindness was immediate and unconditional, a stark contrast to the calculated politeness of New York society. I've prepared the blue suite for you both, Mrs. Hartwell continued, leading them through halls lined with family portraits. Though I suspect you'll find the library more to your liking, Mrs. Blackwood. Your husband spent most of his youth hiding among those books. The library was indeed magnificent. Floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with leather-bound volumes, comfortable reading chairs positioned near tall windows, and a fireplace large enough to warm the entire room. Evangeline's eyes lit up as she took in the collection, her fingers trailing along the spines of books she had only dreamed of reading. You enjoy reading? Mrs. Hartwell asked, noting her interest. Evangeline nodded enthusiastically, then caught herself, remembering her role. But Mrs. Hartwell's expression remained kind, without judgment or suspicion. Wonderful. This collection has been neglected for too long. Perhaps you'll bring it back to life. That evening, as Harrison attended to correspondence in his study, Evangeline found herself alone in the library. The fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows across the walls as she explored the shelves. She selected a volume of poetry, Tennyson's In Memoriam, and settled into a chair near the window. As she read, her lips moved silently, forming the words she dared not speak aloud. The poetry stirred emotions she had kept carefully buried, reminding her of a time when literature and learning had been natural parts of her life. Beautiful words, aren't they? Evangeline startled, looking up to find Mrs. Hartwell approaching with a tea service. The older woman set the tray on a nearby table and poured 2 cups, offering one to Evangeline with a gentle smile. "I've always found Tennyson particularly moving," Mrs. Hartwell continued, settling into the chair opposite. "Though I confess I prefer his earlier works. The Lady of Shalott has always been a favorite of mine." Evangeline's eyes widened slightly. The poem Mrs. Hartwell mentioned was one of her own favorites, a tale of a woman trapped by circumstances beyond her control, watching life pass by through a mirror until she finally chose to face reality directly. "You know it, Mrs.?" Hartwell asked, noting her reaction. Evangeline nodded, then, after a moment's hesitation, reached for paper and pen from the writing desk. She wrote a few lines and handed them to Mrs. Hartwell. She left the web. She left the loom. She made 3 paces through the room. She saw the water lily bloom. She saw the helmet and the plume. She looked down to Camelot. Mrs. Hartwell's eyebrows rose as she read the perfectly quoted verse. "You have an excellent memory, my dear, and beautiful handwriting. Where did you receive your education?" The question hung in the air between them. Evangeline felt the weight of her deception, the burden of maintaining a fiction that grew more complex with each passing day. But something in Mrs. Hartwell's manner, the absence of judgment, the genuine interest, made her want to trust this woman. Instead of answering directly, Evangeline wrote another note. "Sometimes we must become someone else to survive. But books remember who we truly are." Mrs. Hartwell read the words twice, her expression growing thoughtful. "Indeed they do, child. Indeed they do." Over the following weeks, a routine developed at Thornfield Manor. Harrison spent his mornings handling business correspondence and his afternoons riding through the estate or walking the grounds. Evangeline divided her time between the library and long walks through the snow-covered gardens, often accompanied by Mrs. Hartwell. The older woman proved to be an excellent companion, well-read, intelligent, and possessed of a dry wit that reminded Evangeline of someone from her past. During their walks, Mrs. Hartwell shared stories of the manor's history, the Blackwood family's past, and her own observations about the world. "Harrison's mother was much like you," Mrs. Hartwell said one afternoon, as they paused beside a frozen pond. "Quiet, thoughtful, but with depths that most people never suspected. She saw things others missed, understood people in ways that sometimes made them uncomfortable." Evangeline looked at her questioningly, and Mrs. Hartwell continued. "Margaret Blackwood was born Margaret Thornfield. This was her family's estate. She married Cornelius for love, but she never quite fit into his world of business and social climbing. She preferred books to ballrooms, gardens to grand receptions." They walked on in comfortable silence until Mrs. Hartwell spoke again. "She kept a journal, you know, observations about people, about life. I've often wondered what became of it after she died." That evening, Evangeline sat in the library with her own journal open before her. The pages contained 3 years' worth of careful observations, conversations overheard, secrets discovered, the complex web of relationships and rivalries that governed the Blackwood household. She had originally begun writing as a way to maintain her sanity, to prove to herself that she still existed even when the world treated her as invisible. Now, as she read her own words, she realized she had compiled something far more valuable than personal reflections. She had documented evidence of business dealings that skirted the edge of legality, family secrets that could destroy reputations, and personal indiscretions that could topple empires. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Harrison entered, carrying a brandy snifter and wearing an expression of mild curiosity. "Mrs. Hartwell tells me you've been exploring the library extensively." he said, settling into the chair across from her. "She seems quite taken with you." Evangeline closed her journal and nodded politely. "She also mentioned that you seem familiar with literature, more familiar than one might expect." The statement hung between them like a challenge. Evangeline met his gaze steadily, neither confirming nor denying his observation. Harrison leaned forward slightly. "Who are you really, Evangeline? Because I'm beginning to suspect that the woman who appeared at our door 3 years ago is not quite what she seemed." For a long moment they stared at each other across the firelit room. Evangeline could feel the weight of decision pressing upon her. She could continue the charade, maintain her silence, and remain safely invisible. Or she could begin to reveal the truth and risk everything she had carefully built. Finally, she reached for her pen and wrote a single line. "Who any of us really are depends entirely on who is asking and why." Harrison read the words twice, his expression growing more intrigued. "That's not an answer." Evangeline wrote again, "It's the only answer that matters." As Harrison studied her words, Evangeline made a decision that would change the course of both their lives. She opened her journal to a specific page and turned it toward him, revealing a detailed account of a conversation between Cornelius Blackwood and a railroad commissioner, a conversation that had taken place in the study while she dusted nearby. A conversation that involved bribes and illegal land acquisitions. Harrison's face went pale as he read. When he looked up, his eyes held a mixture of shock, fear, and something that might have been respect. "How long have you been documenting our family's business?" he asked quietly. Evangeline wrote her response carefully. "Long enough to understand that silence can be the most powerful weapon of all." The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and both of them understood that their marriage of convenience had just become something far more complex and dangerous. What would Harrison do with the knowledge that his mute wife had been listening all along? And how would this revelation change the balance of power between them? Spring arrived at Thornfield Manor with a burst of color that seemed to mirror the transformation taking place within its walls. The gardens bloomed with daffodils and tulips, while cherry trees scattered pink petals across the gravel paths like confetti. Evangeline stood at the library window, watching the groundskeeper tend to the rose beds, her reflection showing a woman who had changed dramatically over the winter months. Gone was the timid servant girl who had nodded her way through a society wedding. In her place stood someone who carried herself with quiet confidence, her auburn hair styled in a more sophisticated manner, her clothing, a tailored dress of emerald green silk, speaking of refined taste rather than grateful acceptance of charity. The journal that had once been her secret companion now lay open on the desk behind her, its pages having become the foundation of an entirely new relationship with her husband. Over the past 3 months, Harrison had read every entry, his understanding of both his family's business practices and his wife's intelligence growing with each revelation. "The carriage is ready," Harrison announced from the doorway, his own appearance reflecting the changes that had occurred during their time away from the city. The strain that had marked his features on their wedding day had been replaced by something sharper, more focused. He wore a navy blue suit that emphasized his tall frame, and his dark hair was styled in the latest fashion. Evangeline turned from the window, her green eyes meeting his with an understanding that had developed through months of careful communication. She had continued to maintain her silence, but their conversations through written notes had evolved into complex discussions about business, literature, and the intricate politics of New York society. "Are you prepared for what awaits us?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying a note of concern that would have surprised anyone who knew him only as the arrogant heir to a railroad fortune. Evangeline moved to the writing desk and penned a quick response. "I have been preparing for this moment for 3 years. The question is whether New York society is prepared for what I have become." Harrison read her words and smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. "Mrs. Hartwell was right about you. You do have depths that most people never suspect. Their return to New York coincided with the spring social season, and the timing was deliberate. The Astors were hosting their annual charity gala to benefit the city's orphanages, an event that would draw every important family in New York society. It would be Evangeline's first public appearance since the wedding, and both she and Harrison understood that it would set the tone for her acceptance or rejection by the social elite. The Blackwood mansion had been thoroughly cleaned and redecorated during their absence, with fresh flowers in every room and new artwork adorning the walls. But the most significant change was in the household staff's treatment of Evangeline. Where once they had viewed her as an elevated servant, they now approached her with the genuine respect due to the lady of the house. "Welcome home, Mrs. Blackwood," Mrs. Whitmore said as they entered the foyer. "Your correspondence has been sorted and placed in your sitting room, and your dressmaker has sent several new gowns for your approval." Evangeline nodded graciously, then surprised everyone by moving to the writing desk in the hallway and composing a note, which she handed to Mrs. Whitmore. "Thank you for maintaining the household so beautifully in our absence. Please arrange for tea to be served in the library at 4 o'clock. I would like to meet with the senior staff to discuss any changes that may be needed." Mrs. Whitmore read the note with growing amazement. The handwriting was elegant, the language formal but warm, and the content showed a level of household management sophistication that spoke of extensive training in domestic administration. "Of course, ma'am," Mrs. Whitmore replied, her tone reflecting a new level of respect. "Shall I inform your father-in-law of your return?" Harrison answered before Evangeline could write a response. "We'll call on him tomorrow. Tonight, we prepare for the Astor Gala." That evening, Evangeline stood before her dressing room mirror as her lady's maid, a new addition to the household staff, helped her into a gown that would have been impossible to imagine 6 months earlier. The dress was a masterpiece of Worth couture, crafted from midnight blue silk that seemed to capture and reflect light with every movement. The bodice was fitted with intricate beadwork that caught the gaslight like stars, while the skirt fell in elegant lines that emphasized her graceful figure. Her auburn hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that showcased a diamond necklace, a wedding gift from Harrison that she was wearing for the first time. Matching earrings completed the ensemble, and when she turned to view herself from different angles, the transformation was complete. She was no longer Evangeline Rose, the mysterious servant girl. She was Mrs. Harrison Blackwood, and she looked every inch the part. Harrison waited for her in the foyer, and when she descended the grand staircase, his expression showed genuine admiration. "You look magnificent," he said, offering his arm. "Are you ready to remind New York society why they should never underestimate a Blackwood?" The Astor mansion blazed with light as their carriage approached, the sound of music and laughter spilling out into the spring evening. Carriages lined the street, depositing elegantly dressed guests who moved up the red-carpeted steps like participants in an elaborate theatrical production. "Remember," Harrison murmured, as they waited their turn to alight, "you are not the same woman who attended our wedding reception. You are my wife, my equal, and my partner. Let them see that." Evangeline squeezed his arm gently, her touch conveying understanding and determination. Their entrance into the Astor ballroom created exactly the stir they had anticipated. Conversations paused as heads turned to observe the couple who had provided so much gossip fodder throughout the winter. But instead of the awkward, grateful servant girl they expected to see, society found themselves facing a woman who commanded attention through sheer presence. "Harrison, how wonderful to see you back in the city," called Theodore Ashford, approaching with his usual jovial manner. But his eyes were fixed on Evangeline, clearly struggling to reconcile this elegant woman with his memories of the wedding. "Theodore," Harrison replied warmly, "allow me to reintroduce my wife, Evangeline." Evangeline inclined her head graciously, her smile warm but reserved. She had learned to use her silence as a tool, allowing others to fill the conversational space while she observed and assessed. "Mrs. Blackwood," Theodore said, bowing slightly. You look radiant. The country air clearly agreed with you. Before Evangeline could respond with a nod, a familiar voice cut through the pleasantries like a blade. How charming to see the happy couple again. Charlotte Pemberton approached with the predatory grace of a hunting cat, her blonde hair perfectly coiffed and her rose-colored gown designed to emphasize her considerable beauty. But there was something harder in her expression now, a determination that spoke of months spent planning this moment. "Charlotte," Harrison acknowledged coolly, "I trust you've been well." "Quite well, thank you. Though I confess, I've been curious about your wife's recovery. I heard rumors that she's been making remarkable progress with her condition." The challenge in Charlotte's words was unmistakable. She had clearly spent the winter gathering information, and her tone suggested she believed she had discovered something damaging. "My wife's health is not a subject for public discussion," Harrison replied firmly. "Of course not," Charlotte agreed with false sweetness, "though one does wonder about such miraculous improvements. I've been speaking with Dr. Morrison. You remember him, don't you? He specializes in conditions affecting speech and hearing. He finds it quite unusual for someone to remain completely mute for years and then suddenly begin to show signs of communication." Evangeline felt the attention of nearby guests, focusing on their conversation. This was the moment Charlotte had been building toward, a public challenge that would force Evangeline to either maintain her deception or reveal the truth. "What exactly are you implying?" Harrison asked, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Oh, nothing untoward," Charlotte replied airily. "Simply that Dr. Morrison would be fascinated to examine such an unusual case. For medical purposes, of course. He's quite convinced that true mutism of the type your wife displayed is extremely rare and usually accompanied by other indicators." The circle of listeners had grown larger, and Evangeline could feel the weight of their collective attention. She understood that Charlotte was forcing her into an impossible position: submit to medical examination that would expose her deception, or find some way to deflect the challenge without speaking. For a moment, the ballroom seemed to hold its breath. Then Evangeline did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She smiled, not the demure expression of a grateful servant, but the confident smile of a woman who held all the cards. Moving to a nearby table, where place cards were arranged for dinner, she selected a pen from the silver inkwell and wrote something on the back of one of the cards. She handed it to Charlotte with a gracious nod, her green eyes sparkling with what could only be described as amusement. Charlotte read the card, her face going pale as she processed the words. The card trembled slightly in her hands as she looked up at Evangeline with a mixture of shock and fear. "What does it say?" Theodore asked, his curiosity getting the better of his manners. Charlotte's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, her usual composure completely shattered. The card fluttered from her fingers to the floor, where Harrison quickly retrieved it. His eyebrows rose as he read Evangeline's message, and when he looked at his wife, his expression held a mixture of admiration and amazement. "Well?" demanded Mrs. Whitney, who had been drawn into the circle by the drama. "What did she write?" Harrison looked at Charlotte, whose face had gone from pale to flushed with embarrassment. "I think," he said carefully, "that my wife has made her position quite clear. Charlotte, perhaps you'd like to withdraw your suggestion about medical examination?" Charlotte nodded mutely, her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She mumbled an excuse about needing air and fled toward the terrace, leaving behind a crowd of confused and intensely curious onlookers. "Harrison," Mrs. Astor herself approached, her tone carrying the authority of New York's social queen. "I trust there's no unpleasantness occurring at my charity gala." "None whatsoever," Harrison replied smoothly. "Miss Pemberton was simply expressing concern for my wife's well-being," and Evangeline responded with her characteristic grace. Mrs. Astor's sharp eyes moved between Harrison and Evangeline, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand. "Your wife continues to intrigue society, Harrison," Perhaps she would honor us with her presence at my literary salon next week. I understand she has developed quite an appreciation for books during your time in the country." Evangeline inclined her head graciously, accepting the invitation with a dignity that impressed even Mrs. Astor. As the evening progressed, word of the confrontation with Charlotte spread through the ballroom like wildfire. But instead of damaging Evangeline's reputation, the incident seemed to enhance her mystique. Guests who had previously dismissed her as a charity case now approached with genuine curiosity and respect. "Your wife handled that beautifully," Theodore commented to Harrison as they watched Evangeline conversing through written notes with a group of society matrons. Whatever she wrote to Charlotte certainly put an end to that line of inquiry. Harrison smiled, fingering the card that remained in his pocket. Evangeline's message had been simple but devastating. "I know about your debts to the gambling houses on Bleecker Street. Shall we discuss medical examinations, or would you prefer to discuss your need for discretion?" The revelation that his quiet wife had somehow acquired such specific and damaging information about Charlotte Pemberton was both thrilling and terrifying. It confirmed what he had begun to suspect during their months at Thornfield, that Evangeline was far more than she appeared, and that her years of silence had been spent gathering intelligence that could reshape the balance of power in New York society. As the evening drew to a close and they prepared to leave, Harrison offered Evangeline his arm with genuine pride. "You were magnificent tonight," he murmured as they waited for their carriage. "Though I confess, I'm beginning to wonder what other secrets you've been keeping." Evangeline looked up at him with that enigmatic smile that had become her trademark, then withdrew a small card from her reticule and handed it to him. "The most interesting secrets are the ones people keep from themselves. Tomorrow, we visit your father. It's time he learned what his mute daughter-in-law has been observing all these years." Harrison read the words twice, his expression growing thoughtful. "Are you declaring war on my family?" Evangeline's response was swift. "I'm declaring independence. There's a difference." As their carriage pulled away from the Astor mansion, both Harrison and Evangeline understood that their return to New York society marked the beginning of a new chapter, one in which the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed. What would happen when Cornelius Blackwood discovered that his son's convenient marriage had produced not a grateful, silent wife, but a formidable adversary who knew all his secrets? The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Cornelius Blackwood's study as Harrison and Evangeline were announced by the butler. The patriarch of the Blackwood Empire sat behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing financial reports with the same intensity he had brought to building his railroad fortune. At 62, Cornelius remained an imposing figure, silver-haired, sharp-eyed, and possessed of the ruthless intelligence that had elevated him from modest beginnings to the pinnacle of New York society. "Harrison," he said, without looking up from his papers, "I trust last evening's social reappearance went according to plan." "Better than expected," Harrison replied, guiding Evangeline to one of the leather chairs facing the desk. Evangeline made quite an impression. Cornelius finally raised his eyes, taking in his daughter-in-law's appearance with the calculating gaze of a man who assessed everything in terms of profit and loss. Evangeline wore a tailored suit of deep burgundy wool, her hair arranged in a sophisticated chignon that emphasized her elegant neck. She looked every inch the society matron, but there was something in her green eyes that hadn't been there before, a quiet confidence that made Cornelius pause. "Indeed," he said slowly. "Mrs. Whitmore mentioned that you've been communicating more extensively through written correspondence. I trust this development won't complicate our arrangement." Evangeline reached into her small leather portfolio and withdrew a sheet of cream-colored stationery. She wrote briefly, then handed the paper to Cornelius with a gracious smile. "I understand that my role in this family requires discretion and loyalty. I am prepared to fulfill both obligations, provided certain conditions are met." Cornelius read the note twice, his eyebrows rising slightly. The handwriting was impeccable, the language formal and precise. This was not the grateful, subservient response he had expected from the woman he still thought of as a rescued servant. "Conditions?" he repeated, his voice carrying a warning edge. Evangeline wrote again. "I would like to establish a charitable foundation in the Blackwood name, focusing on education for disadvantaged women. I believe it would enhance the family's reputation while serving a worthy cause." "Charitable work is appropriate for a woman of your position," Cornelius conceded, though his tone remained cautious. "What sort of involvement did you have in mind?" Instead of writing another note, Evangeline opened her portfolio and withdrew a thick document bound in blue ribbon. She placed it on the desk before Cornelius, her movements deliberate and confident. Cornelius untied the ribbon and began to read, his expression growing increasingly grave with each page. The document contained detailed financial projections, proposed board members, educational curricula, and a comprehensive plan for establishing schools in 3 major cities. But more disturbing were the footnotes, references to specific Blackwood business practices, mentions of particular contracts and partnerships, and subtle implications that suggested the author possessed intimate knowledge of the family's affairs. "Where did you obtain this information?" Cornelius asked quietly, his voice carrying a dangerous undertone. Evangeline wrote her response carefully. 3 years of careful observation have provided me with a comprehensive understanding of Blackwood enterprises. I believe this knowledge could be put to constructive use." Harrison watched the exchange with growing fascination. He had known that Evangeline possessed damaging information about the family, but seeing her present it so strategically to his father revealed a level of sophistication he was still learning to appreciate. "You're suggesting that your silence regarding our business practices is contingent upon our support for your charitable endeavors?" Cornelius asked. "I'm suggesting that mutual cooperation serves everyone's interests better than mutual suspicion," Evangeline wrote. "The foundation would benefit from Blackwood resources and connections, while the family would benefit from the positive publicity and my continued discretion." Cornelius leaned back in his chair, studying the woman who had just presented him with the most elegant blackmail proposal he had ever encountered. The servant girl who had appeared at their door 3 years ago had somehow transformed into a formidable negotiator who understood both the value of information and the art of leverage. "And if we decline your proposal?" he asked. Evangeline's smile remained pleasant as she wrote, "Then I suppose we would need to discuss alternative arrangements for my continued residence in New York society." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Cornelius understood that his son's mute wife had just revealed herself to be anything but powerless. A knock at the study door interrupted the tense silence. Mrs. Whitmore entered with a tea service, her timing so perfect that Harrison suspected it had been deliberately arranged. "Shall I serve, sir?" she asked, her eyes moving between the 3 occupants of the room with the keen awareness of someone who had witnessed many family dramas. "Please," Cornelius replied, using the interruption to gather his thoughts. As Mrs. Whitmore poured tea and arranged delicate china cups, Evangeline wrote another note and handed it to Harrison. "Your father is reconsidering his assessment of my value to this family. That's progress." Harrison read the note and couldn't suppress a slight smile. His wife's ability to read people and situations was proving to be as sharp as her penmanship. "Mrs. Blackwood," Cornelius said as Mrs. Whitmore departed, "I find myself curious about your background. Your proposal demonstrates a level of education and sophistication that seems inconsistent with your previous circumstances." Evangeline sipped her tea thoughtfully before responding in writing. "Sometimes circumstances force us to become less than we are capable of being. I prefer to focus on what we might become, rather than what we have been." "A diplomatic answer," Cornelius observed, "but not a complete one. Complete answers require complete trust," Evangeline wrote. "Perhaps we might build toward that gradually." Over the following hour, they negotiated the terms of what would become the Blackwood Foundation for Women's Education. Evangeline's proposals were detailed and practical, demonstrating not only her understanding of charitable work, but also her grasp of public relations and social positioning. By the time they concluded their discussion, Cornelius had agreed to provide initial funding of $50,000 and the use of Blackwood connections to establish the Foundation's board of directors. "You drive a hard bargain, my dear," Cornelius said as they prepared to leave. "I begin to understand why Harrison was so taken with you." Evangeline wrote one final note. "I prefer to think of it as finding common ground. The Foundation will benefit everyone involved." As they departed the study, Harrison offered Evangeline his arm with genuine admiration. "That was masterfully done," he murmured as they walked toward their carriage, "though I suspect my father is now questioning everything he thought he knew about our marriage." "Good," Evangeline wrote on a small card. "Predictability is the enemy of respect." Their next stop was the offices of Hartwell and Associates, the law firm that had handled Blackwood family affairs for 2 generations. James Hartwell, Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell's nephew and a Harvard-educated attorney, had been expecting their visit. "Harrison, Mrs. Blackwood." He greeted them warmly as they entered his mahogany-paneled office. "My aunt speaks of you both with great fondness. I understand you wish to establish a charitable foundation." What followed was a detailed legal discussion about incorporation, tax implications, and governance structures. Evangeline participated fully through written communication, her questions revealing a sophisticated understanding of legal and financial matters that impressed even the experienced attorney. "Your wife has an excellent grasp of corporate law," James commented to Harrison during a brief recess. "Has she studied these matters formally?" "Evangeline has many talents that continue to surprise me," Harrison replied diplomatically. When they returned to the main discussion, Evangeline presented James with another document, a detailed analysis of existing charitable organizations, their strengths and weaknesses, and recommendations for avoiding common pitfalls in foundation management. "This is remarkably thorough," James said as he reviewed her work. "You've clearly researched this extensively." Evangeline wrote, "I believe in being prepared. The Foundation's success will depend on careful planning and execution." By the end of the afternoon, the legal framework for the Blackwood Foundation had been established, with Evangeline designated as its founding director and Harrison as chairman of the board. The arrangement would give her significant autonomy while maintaining the family's oversight and control. As they returned home, Harrison reflected on the day's events. "You've accomplished more in one afternoon than most people manage in months," he said. "The foundation, the negotiation with my father, the legal arrangements, it's all been handled with remarkable efficiency." Evangeline wrote, "I've had 3 years to plan this. Today was simply the execution of a carefully considered strategy." "And what's the next phase of your strategy?" Harrison asked. "Integration," she wrote. "I need to establish myself as a legitimate member of New York society, not just as your wife, but as an individual with her own interests and capabilities." That evening, as they dressed for dinner at the Union Club, Harrison's exclusive gentlemen's organization that had recently begun allowing wives to attend certain social functions, Evangeline stood before her mirror with a sense of satisfaction she hadn't felt in years. The woman reflected back at her bore little resemblance to the desperate girl who had appeared at the Blackwood mansion 3 years earlier. Her burgundy silk evening gown was perfectly tailored, her jewelry tasteful but expensive, and her bearing confident without being arrogant. She had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of New York society and emerged not just as a survivor, but as a player in her own right. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Harrison entered, resplendent in his evening wear, carrying a small velvet box. "I have something for you," he said, opening the box to reveal a stunning emerald brooch surrounded by diamonds. "It belonged to my mother. I thought you might like to wear it tonight." Evangeline's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of the gesture. Margaret Blackwood's jewelry had been carefully preserved since her death, and Harrison's decision to share it represented a level of acceptance and respect that went far beyond their original business arrangement. She wrote quickly, "It's beautiful. Are you certain?" "I'm certain," Harrison replied, pinning the brooch to her gown with careful precision. "You've earned the right to wear it." As they prepared to leave for the evening, Evangeline caught sight of herself in the hallway mirror. The emerald brooch caught the light, creating tiny rainbows that danced across the walls. But more than the jewelry, it was the expression on her face that marked the transformation, the quiet confidence of a woman who had found her voice, even in silence. The Union Club's dining room buzzed with conversation as New York's elite gathered for the monthly social dinner. Evangeline moved through the crowd on Harrison's arm, noting how differently people responded to her now. Where once they had offered polite condescension, they now showed genuine interest and respect. "Mrs. Blackwood," called Senator Morrison, approaching with his wife, "I understand you're establishing a foundation for women's education. My wife has been quite interested in such causes." Mrs. Morrison, a formidable woman in her own right, extended her hand warmly. "I'd be delighted to discuss your plans, my dear. Perhaps we might arrange a meeting next week." Evangeline nodded graciously and wrote a brief response. "I would be honored by your involvement. Education is the foundation of all progress." "Beautifully put," Senator Morrison said, reading over his wife's shoulder. "You know, there's been talk in Washington about federal support for educational initiatives. Your foundation might be perfectly positioned to benefit from such programs." As the evening progressed, Evangeline found herself at the center of numerous conversations about education, charity work, and social reform. Her written responses were thoughtful and well-informed, demonstrating a grasp of complex issues that impressed even the most sophisticated members of New York society. "Your wife is quite remarkable," Theodore Ashford commented to Harrison as they watched Evangeline discussing foundation plans with a group of influential women. "I confess I had my doubts about your marriage initially, but she's proven to be an exceptional addition to our social circle." Harrison smiled, watching his wife with genuine pride. "She continues to surprise me every day." "There's something I should mention," Theodore said, lowering his voice. "Charlotte Pemberton has been spreading rumors about your wife's background. Nothing specific, but she's been suggesting that there are inconsistencies in Evangeline's story." "What sort of inconsistencies?" Harrison asked, though his tone remained casual. "Questions about her education, her family background, her sudden appearance in New York. Charlotte seems convinced that your wife is not what she appears to be." Harrison considered this information carefully. "And what do you think?" Theodore glanced at Evangeline, who was currently writing detailed responses to questions about curriculum development and teacher training. "I think your wife is exactly what she appears to be. An intelligent, educated woman who has found her place in society. Whatever her past may have been, her present speaks for itself." As the evening drew to a close, Harrison and Evangeline prepared to depart. Several people approached to express their interest in supporting the foundation, and Evangeline's small notebook was filled with names and contact information. "A successful evening," Harrison observed as their carriage pulled away from the club. Evangeline wrote, "The foundation will have strong support, but Charlotte Pemberton remains a problem." "Theodore mentioned her continued interest in your background," Harrison said. "Are you concerned?" "Not concerned," Evangeline wrote, "but prepared. Charlotte's persistence may require a more definitive response." Harrison read her words with growing curiosity. "What sort of response did you have in mind?" Evangeline's smile in the dim carriage light was enigmatic as she wrote her final note of the evening. "Sometimes the best defense is a strategic offense. Charlotte has secrets of her own, and I believe it's time she learned the value of discretion." As their carriage wound through the gaslit streets of New York, both Harrison and Evangeline understood that their carefully orchestrated return to society was nearing its climax. The foundation was established, their social position was secure, and Evangeline had successfully transformed herself from a grateful charity case into a respected member of the elite. But Charlotte Pemberton's continued threats meant that one final confrontation was inevitable. A confrontation that would determine not just Evangeline's future in New York society, but the very nature of truth and power in the glittering world of the Gilded Age. What devastating revelation would finally silence Charlotte's accusations, and how would it reshape the delicate balance of secrets that govern New York's most powerful families? 6 months had passed since the establishment of the Blackwood Foundation for Women's Education, and the crisp October air of 1896 carried with it the scent of change throughout New York City. The foundation's first school had opened its doors in the Lower East Side, housed in a beautifully renovated brownstone that had once been a private mansion. Young women from immigrant families now walked through halls lined with books and scientific instruments, their voices echoing with discussions of literature, mathematics, and the expanding possibilities of their futures. Evangeline stood in the school's main classroom, watching as 23 students, ranging in age from 16 to 25, participated in a spirited debate about women's suffrage. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces bright with intelligence and determination. These young women, many of whom had worked in factories or as domestic servants to support their families, now spent their mornings in pursuit of education that would open doors previously barred to them. Mrs. Blackwood, called Maria Santos, a 19-year-old whose family had emigrated from Italy. What do you think about Miss Anthony's argument that education must come before political rights? Evangeline moved to the blackboard and wrote her response in clear, elegant script. I believe education and political rights must advance together. An educated woman without the vote is still powerless to change unjust laws, while a woman with the vote but without education may not understand how to use that power effectively. The students nodded thoughtfully, several taking notes in the composition books the foundation provided. Evangeline had discovered that her written communication style actually enhanced her teaching effectiveness. Students paid closer attention to her carefully crafted responses, and the act of writing her thoughts gave weight to her words that spoken instruction might have lacked. Miss Chen, Evangeline wrote, addressing a young Chinese-American woman whose mathematical abilities had impressed even the Harvard-educated instructors, would you share your thoughts on how education might help women overcome cultural barriers? Lily Chen stood gracefully, her dark eyes bright with intelligence. In my family's culture, women are expected to be silent and obedient. But here, I'm learning that silence can be a choice rather than an obligation. When I understand mathematics and science, I can contribute to my family's business in ways that honor both my heritage and my capabilities. Evangeline smiled and wrote, Wisdom lies in understanding that strength can take many forms. Sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that chooses when to speak and when to listen. After the morning classes concluded, Evangeline made her way to her office on the second floor of the building. The room was elegantly appointed but practical, with a large desk positioned near windows that overlooked the bustling street below. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with educational texts, literature, and the growing collection of reports from similar institutions across the country. Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, who had agreed to serve as the school's administrative director, knocked softly before entering. At 68, the former Thornfield Manor housekeeper had proven to be an invaluable ally in managing both the educational programs and the complex social dynamics that surrounded the foundation's work. The morning classes went beautifully, Mrs. Hartwell observed, settling into the chair across from Evangeline's desk. Miss Chen's presentation on applied mathematics was particularly impressive. I believe she's ready for advanced placement at Barnard College. Evangeline wrote, Her family is concerned about the expense and the social implications. Perhaps we could arrange a scholarship through the foundation's connections. An excellent idea. I'll speak with James about the legal arrangements. Mrs. Hartwell paused, her expression growing more serious. There's another matter we need to discuss. Charlotte Pemberton has been making inquiries about the foundation's funding sources. Evangeline's pen stilled for a moment before she wrote, "What sort of inquiries?" "She's been asking questions about your personal involvement in the financial planning, suggesting that someone with your background couldn't possibly have developed such sophisticated funding strategies without assistance. She's still trying to prove that I'm not what I appear to be," Evangeline wrote. "What has she discovered?" "Nothing concrete, but she's been persistent. She's also been spreading rumors that the foundation is somehow connected to irregular Blackwood business practices." Evangeline set down her pen and moved to the window, gazing down at the street where her students were walking home, their arms filled with books and their faces bright with purpose. After a long moment, she returned to her desk and wrote a lengthy response. "Charlotte's persistence has become dangerous, not just to me but to the foundation and everyone it serves. These young women deserve better than to have their education threatened by one woman's vendetta. It's time to end this definitively." "What do you propose?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, though her tone suggested she suspected the answer might be dramatic. Evangeline opened her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder bound with black ribbon. She placed it before Mrs. Hartwell, who opened it with growing amazement. The folder contained detailed documentation of Charlotte Pemberton's financial situation, gambling debts, unpaid bills to dressmakers and jewelers, and most damaging of all, evidence of her involvement in a scheme to sell information about wealthy families' private affairs to newspaper gossip columnists. "How did you obtain all this?" Mrs. Hartwell asked quietly. 3 years of careful observation taught me that information is the most valuable currency in New York society," Evangeline wrote. "I've been documenting everyone's secrets, not just the Blackwoods. Charlotte made the mistake of assuming that a mute servant was also deaf and blind." Mrs. Hartwell studied the documents with the sharp eye of someone who had managed household accounts for decades. "This is quite comprehensive and quite damaging. Charlotte has forced this confrontation. I had hoped to avoid it, but she's left me no choice." That evening, Evangeline sat in her private sitting room at the Blackwood mansion, preparing for what she knew would be the final act in her long transformation from servant to society matron. She wore a gown of deep purple silk that emphasized her auburn hair and green eyes, and Margaret Blackwood's emerald jewelry caught the lamplight as she moved. Harrison entered as she was reviewing her correspondence, his expression showing the strain of a difficult day managing railroad business. The past months had seen him grow into his role as head of Blackwood Enterprises, his father having gradually ceded more authority as Harrison proved his capabilities. "The foundation's success continues to amaze me," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "Senator Morrison mentioned that there's talk of federal funding for similar programs." Evangeline wrote, "The students' achievements speak for themselves. Maria Santos has been accepted to the normal school for teacher training, and Lily Chen will begin at Barnard in the spring." "You've given them opportunities they never could have imagined," Harrison observed, "but Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that Charlotte is still causing problems." "Not for much longer," Evangeline wrote. "I've arranged to meet with her tomorrow afternoon. It's time to resolve this situation permanently." Harrison read her words with growing concern. "What sort of resolution did you have in mind?" Instead of writing a response, Evangeline handed him the black folder. As he read through Charlotte's documented indiscretions, his eyebrows rose steadily higher. "This is comprehensive," he said finally, "and devastating. How long have you been compiling this information?" "Since our wedding reception, when she first challenged me publicly. I realized then that she would never stop trying to expose what she believed to be my deception. And now she'll learn that some secrets are more dangerous than others." The following afternoon, Charlotte Pemberton arrived at the Blackwood mansion dressed in her finest attire, clearly expecting to deliver some sort of ultimatum. She was shown to the formal drawing room, where Evangeline waited with the calm composure that had become her trademark. "Mrs. Blackwood," Charlotte said with false sweetness, settling into a silk-upholstered chair. "How kind of you to agree to this meeting. I felt it was time we had a frank discussion about your situation." Evangeline inclined her head graciously and gestured toward the tea service that had been prepared. As Charlotte helped herself to delicate sandwiches and pastries, Evangeline wrote a brief note and handed it to her. "I understand you have concerns about my background. Perhaps we can address them directly." Charlotte read the note with satisfaction, clearly believing she had gained the upper hand. "Indeed I do. You see, I've been conducting my own investigation into your past, and I've discovered some very interesting inconsistencies." She opened her reticule and withdrew a small notebook, consulting it with theatrical precision. "For instance, there's no record of an Evangeline Rose arriving in New York during the period when you supposedly appeared at this household seeking work. No ship manifests, no immigration records, no documentation whatsoever." Evangeline wrote, "Record-keeping can be inconsistent, especially for people of modest circumstances." "Perhaps," Charlotte agreed, "but there are other anomalies. Your handwriting, for example, shows clear evidence of expensive education. Your knowledge of literature, your understanding of business matters, your sophisticated approach to charitable work. None of it fits with the story of a desperate servant girl. Education can be acquired in many ways," Evangeline wrote. "Books are available to anyone who seeks them." Charlotte's smile grew more predatory, but the most interesting discovery was this. She produced a newspaper clipping from her notebook, placing it on the table between them with obvious satisfaction. The clipping was from a Boston newspaper dated 3 years earlier. The headline read, "Prominent Family Mourns Daughter's Disappearance." Below was a photograph of a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to Evangeline, though the hair was darker and the clothing more elaborate. "Miss Evangeline Thornfield," Charlotte read aloud, "daughter of the late Judge Marcus Thornfield of Boston, disappeared from her family's Beacon Hill mansion 3 years ago, following a scandal involving her engagement to a prominent businessman who was later revealed to be already married." Evangeline's expression remained calm as she read the clipping, though her fingers tightened slightly on her pen. The family offered a substantial reward for information about her whereabouts, Charlotte continued. They believed she might have suffered some sort of breakdown following the public humiliation of the broken engagement. "An interesting story," Evangeline wrote. "But what does it have to do with me?" "Oh, I think you know exactly what it has to do with you," Charlotte replied triumphantly. "You're not a mute servant girl at all. You're Evangeline Thornfield, a runaway heiress who created a false identity to escape scandal in Boston." For a long moment, the drawing room was silent, except for the ticking of the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. Then Evangeline smiled, not the demure expression Charlotte expected, but the confident smile of someone who had been waiting for this moment. She wrote a single word. "Proof?" "The resemblance is unmistakable," Charlotte insisted. "The timing fits perfectly, and it explains everything about your education and sophistication." "Resemblance is not proof," Evangeline wrote. "And even if your theory were correct, what would you propose to do with this information?" Charlotte leaned forward eagerly. "I propose that you confess the truth to Harrison and his father, admit that your marriage was based on deception, and agree to a quiet annulment. In exchange, I'll keep your secret and allow you to return to Boston with your reputation intact." Evangeline set down her pen and moved to the window, gazing out at the garden where autumn flowers bloomed in defiance of the approaching winter. When she returned to her seat, she wrote a longer response. "Your proposal assumes that I have something to hide and something to fear, but what if I told you that you're the one who should be concerned about exposure?" Charlotte's confident expression faltered slightly. "What do you mean?" Instead of writing another note, Evangeline opened the drawer of the side table and withdrew the black folder. She placed it before Charlotte, who opened it with growing alarm. As Charlotte read through the documented evidence of her gambling debts, her financial indiscretions, and most damaging of all, her arrangement to sell society gossip to newspaper columnists, her face went progressively paler. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. Evangeline wrote, "The same place I learned about your theory regarding my identity. Information has a way of revealing itself to those who know how to listen." "You can't prove any of this," Charlotte said, though her voice lacked conviction. "I don't need to prove it," Evangeline wrote. "I simply need to share it with the right people. Mrs. Astor, for instance, would be very interested to learn that someone in her inner circle has been selling stories about private conversations to the press." Charlotte's hands trembled as she closed the folder. "What do you want?" "I want you to stop your investigation into my background. I want you to cease spreading rumors about the Foundation. And I want you to understand that some secrets are more dangerous than others." "And if I refuse?" Evangeline's final note was brief but decisive. "Then tomorrow's newspapers will make for very interesting reading." Charlotte stared at the words, understanding that she had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. The woman she had dismissed as a fraud had proven to be a far more formidable opponent than she had ever imagined. "You win," Charlotte said quietly, rising from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. "But this isn't over." "Yes," Evangeline wrote, "it is." After Charlotte departed, Evangeline remained in the drawing room, watching the afternoon light fade into evening. She had successfully protected her new life, her marriage, and most importantly, the foundation that was providing opportunities for young women who deserved better than the limitations society had placed upon them. Harrison found her there an hour later, still sitting by the window, with the black folder on the table beside her. "Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that Charlotte paid you a visit," he said, settling into the chair Charlotte had vacated. "I trust the meeting was productive?" "The matter has been resolved," Evangeline wrote. "Charlotte will no longer be a problem for the Foundation or for us." Harrison picked up the newspaper clipping that Charlotte had left behind, studying the photograph with interest. "There is a resemblance," he observed quietly. Evangeline met his gaze steadily and wrote, "Does it matter who I was before I became your wife?" Harrison considered the question carefully. "The woman I married has built a successful educational foundation, earned the respect of New York society, and proven herself to be an invaluable partner in both business and life. Whatever name she carried before, whatever circumstances brought her to our door, none of that changes who she has become." "And who have I become?" Evangeline wrote. "You've become exactly who you were meant to be," Harrison replied. "A woman who found her voice, even in silence, and used it to change the world around her." As winter settled over New York City, the Blackwood Foundation for Women's Education continued to flourish. A second school opened in Brooklyn, and plans were underway for a third in Philadelphia. Evangeline's reputation as an educational reformer had spread beyond New York, with invitations arriving from women's organizations across the country. On a snowy December evening, exactly 1 year after their return from Thornfield Manor, Evangeline sat in the library of the Blackwood mansion, writing in her journal by the light of the fire. The pages now contained not secrets and observations, but plans and dreams for the future, curriculum developments, scholarship programs, and the expanding vision of what education could accomplish. Harrison entered carrying 2 glasses of brandy, settling into the chair across from her with the comfortable familiarity of a true partnership. "The Foundation's annual report makes for impressive reading," he said, offering her one of the glasses. 47 graduates in our first year, with 32 going on to higher education or professional training. Each one represents a life changed, Evangeline wrote, a future that wouldn't have existed without opportunity. "Like yours?" Harrison asked gently. Evangeline considered the question, then wrote a response that captured the essence of her remarkable journey. "I learned that sometimes we must lose ourselves completely before we can discover who we're truly meant to become." The woman who appeared at your door 3 years ago was running from her past. The woman sitting here tonight has chosen her future. Outside, snow continued to fall on the city that had become her home, covering the streets where young women now walked with books under their arms and dreams in their hearts. In the warm glow of the library, surrounded by the tools of learning and the evidence of progress, Evangeline Rose Blackwood, whatever her true name might have been, had finally found her voice in the silence she had chosen, and in choosing it, had discovered the power to change not just her own life, but the lives of countless others. The mute servant who had once been invisible had become a woman whose influence would be felt for generations to come, proving that sometimes the most profound transformations begin not with words, but with the courage to remain silent until the moment comes to speak, or in her case to write, the truth that changes everything. In the end, she had bloomed exactly where she was planted, transforming not just herself, but the very soil in which she grew. What an incredible journey we've witnessed together. From a desperate young woman seeking refuge to a powerful force for change in Gilded Age New York, Evangeline's story reminds us that our past doesn't define our future. Our choices do. If this tale of transformation, resilience, and the power of education moved you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What moment in Evangeline's journey resonated most with you? Do you believe she was truly Evangeline Thornfield or someone else entirely? Don't forget to subscribe for more captivating historical dramas that explore the untold stories of remarkable women who changed the world through courage, intelligence, and determination. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that might just inspire your own transformation. And remember, sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that chooses exactly when and how to speak. What will your voice say when your moment comes?